Okay, I want to record just a quick something about the 18th and 19th Amendments. So here we're talking about prohibition and the right of women to vote. Um, for women, both of those issues are actually related, not for every woman, but for many women. The passing of the 18th Amendment is related to advocacy by women, political activism by women, even before they formally receive the right to vote. Um, in order to understand the context of all this, I want to talk about what a new woman is in the progressive era, how we are newly beginning to define what a woman is capable of and is allowed, frankly, is allowed to do. We have talked a lot about the role of women in the early days of the United States. We referred to this time, or her role in this time, as sort of Republican motherhood, that they were the mothers of the Republic, that it was their job. And in this way, it's a lot like, women were viewed in ancient Greece in some ways, that they are the culture bearers, that it's their job to pass down morality and values to children. And so, in a lot of ways, women are consistently, in many societies, including this one, I would argue, held to a higher moral and in some cases even patriotic standard because they are seen as the ones responsible for passing patriotism and morality down to their children. So if you have a man with loose morals, questionable character, they can oftentimes be overlooked because they are not in danger of passing that on. But if you have a woman of questionable character, it's different. As we move into the early 1900s, women maintain a large part of that role, but opportunities for women are expanding. Women are increasingly spending more time away from home, depending on what class of socioeconomic class or category you fall into. The reasoning for that is different. You might be working maybe at a factory job, or you might be out socializing with your friends. Clubs like the Junior League of Memphis, for example, are going to spring up during this time period. Social activities become a really important thing for women who are upper middle class or even middle class or even upper class, right? Okay. Women are also having fewer children, and a lot of that is to do with the fact that they're moving into urban areas, and so they're not working on farms. They don't need as many helpers and as many hands to help. And also, more of the children that they are giving birth to are surviving through childhood into adulthood. And it's sort of a morbid or a grim thought to think about the idea that women had to have, 10 babies in order to ensure that they had 4 kids. Survive, but that's not as much the case anymore with medical advancements. Schools started earlier. Women started to go to school at younger ages, and they were staying longer, although they did not stay in school as long as men. And especially upper class women, as I mentioned, are joining social clubs. And those social clubs will eventually come to be the ones calling loudest for suffrage. And suffrage is the right to vote for women. Keep that in mind. Many women are also going to be involved in this temperance movement. The temperance movement is an old movement that is going to view alcohol consumption as a danger to society. So if we think about women in this role as a Republican mother, then their role then is to shout from the rooftops, this is a destructive element in our society. If you also think about the progressive era and its goal of efficiencies, one of the things making society most inefficient was a high level of alcohol consumption. Women saw it as something that was hurting their family. The advertisements at the time in favor of temperance, the newsletters and pamphlets that were being printed that were pro-temperance, were saying things like, you're destroying our family, that men were working long hours in industrial conditions and then going to bars and spending their wages instead of bringing that money home to their families. So that's a concern for women. They're going to couch it to get support of the business community by saying this is making your business less efficient. And oftentimes, even liquor industry is reviewed as a trust. So if you are a progressive interested in efficiencies and trust busting, then the temperance movement is something that appeals to you. In 1873, as far back as 1873, you have the Women's Temperance Union, led by a woman named Frances Willard. You have the Anti-Saloon League in 1893. You have calls for initially for the abolition of saloons or bars, and eventually a call for the prohibition of alcohol. And here's an example of one of those advertisements, I'm going to say propaganda, wet or dry. So wet would mean in favor of continuing to allow alcohol consumption and sales, and then dry would be against. And for the wet side, it says, vote wet for my sake. He's a brewer. He's obviously gotten fat on his profits. And then vote dry for mine is the mother at home alone with her children, presumably waiting for their drunk father to come home. The 18th Amendment will ultimately be passed. It will be in effect until it is repealed in 1933. Women's suffrage is really the defining issue for women of this time period, I think, obviously. I first want to say that there are women voting in the United States before the 19th Amendment in 1920. The 19th Amendment gives women the right to vote across the board in all states. It's a federal amendment. It is the law of the land in the United States. However, there are other places, or not other places, there are some states in the United States that had already individually decided to give women the right to vote. Not many, but some. In the early days of the United States, so like late 1700s, there were a couple of states, I think Massachusetts is among them, that gives women the right to vote and then rescinds the right to vote in like 1805 or 1807. And then as we get closer to this amendment, in 1920, we also have some states out west, like Colorado, that will give women the right to vote earlier than the amendment. And there is a debate among suffragettes, amongst women who are pushing for suffrage, about which tactic to take. Do you go after local level reform, try to get each individual state to grant women the right to vote? Or do you approach this as a national campaign and push for an amendment? So you're going to see different names of different suffrage organizations, and you might be wondering to yourself, why is there more than one? It's because they disagree in their methodology in a lot of ways. The first convention to actively call for a women's suffrage amendment is held in 1848 in Seneca Falls, New York. And remember, again, suffrage is the right to vote. Two of the earliest calls for women's suffrage come from these very important women, Elizabeth Cady Stanton on the left and Susan B. Anthony on the right, both formidable activists in their time. Many women's rights advocates had also been abolitionists, and they had really thought that once African Americans were given the right to vote, that they would be included in both the 14th and the 15th Amendment, that women would be given the right to vote along with former slaves, and that they would be given the same sort of equal protection under the law that is spelled out for African Americans. They were very disappointed when that didn't happen, and it took them a while to regain their footing from that sort of defeat and figure out what their progress was going to be. And again, we have a couple of different schools of thought. Those in favor of a constitutional amendment were really part of the National Women's Suffrage Association, the NWSA, led by Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton. And those who wanted to let the states move in that direction first were the American Women's Suffrage Association, led by women like Lucy Stone and Julia Ward Howe. And this is Julia Ward Howe. This is Lucy Stone. This is an example of an advertisement taken out by those opposed to women by a women's group, the Virginia Association Opposed to Women's Suffrage. These are women who say that they do not want the right to vote because they felt that the right to vote would push them into a role in society that they did not see as helpful for women. The advertisement is targeted towards men. It says, "Men, you are making the world safe for democracy and also safe for women, that your mothers, sisters, and wives may never have to suffer as the women of Belgium and France have suffered. All women thank you. Men manage most of our business. Our government is a very big business. Most women want men to manage our government. Only a few women want suffrage. Shall these few women force all women into politics? Women can do their bit best outside of politics. Our hands are full already with work which only women can do. Women are free from the duty of fighting, protect us in our right to be free from political duties." Of course, the 19th Amendment to the Constitution does come. I always find this amendment pretty easy to remember. 19th Amendment happens in 1920, and it says, "The right of citizens of the United States to vote shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or by any state on account of sex." This really comes once the two groups join forces in 1890 and form the National American Women's Suffrage Association. They have a couple of goals, but their first big goal is for women to become politically engaged. We're going to march, we're going to picket, we're going to raise our voices. An example of this was the National Women's Party, led by a woman named Alice Paul, and I think, I'll have her picture in a second. Cherry Chapman Catt is another leader that organizes the final push, and she's up there in the top, well, on the right, but the image on the left. She does a really interesting thing. She says, "Listen, we are not here to challenge you men. We want to remain in our traditional spheres, but we think that our role as women can be enhanced if we can take part in the political process." And that, in the end, is the framing of the conversation that is successful. So while Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton rightly get a lot of the praise for bringing this conversation forward, the woman who gets it across the finish line and who finally figures out how to frame the conversation with in a way that doesn't scare people is Carrie Chapman Catt. I don't think she gets enough recognition for that. So let's form a Carrie Chapman Catt fan club. The 19th Amendment will be ratified in 1920, and I have a little video.
Hi, my name is Matthew Pinsker. I'm a historian, and here are some things you need to know to sound smart about the 19th Amendment. The 19th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution, the one that guaranteed women the right to vote, was ratified in 1920. But the truth is, women had been voting in American elections for long before that. In the early years of the Republic, for example, there were some places where women voted, in the state of New Jersey until 1807. But in most cases, women were denied the right to vote in the 19th century. They started agitating for the right to vote openly and in public in the late 1840s and early 1850s after meetings in places like Seneca Falls in New York. During the Civil War period, women were involved in the fight against slavery and the fight to save the Union. After the Civil War, leaders like Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony thought that their fight to end slavery would get them included in the amendments like the 14th Amendment and the 15th Amendment that guaranteed the rights to former slaves, and they lost. It was a devastating blow to their cause, and so they reorganized themselves in a long campaign for suffrage. Sometimes they did this on a state-by-state or territory-by-territory basis, especially effective out west. Then there were women led by Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton who organized the National Women's Suffrage Association. They were fighting to change the Constitution. Sometimes they fought in the courts. They actually tried to vote. Susan B. Anthony got herself arrested at one point doing that. Ultimately, these fights converged at the beginning of the 20th century and during the era of World War I. There was a serious campaign to try to change the Constitution. They had what they called silent sentinels posted outside the White House with protest signs. Those silent sentinels were arrested by municipal authorities and imprisoned. It was a stark moment in the history of women's rights, women being imprisoned, and in some cases force-fed. Eventually, women gained the right to vote in states like New York. They convinced Woodrow Wilson to support women's suffrage, and finally, by 1919, the Congress had endorsed, after much struggle, this proposed amendment to the U.S. Constitution. And women began voting wholesale across the country in the presidential election of 1920.
Young people in large numbers came out.
Okay, something important to note. There were some members of this women's suffrage movement, and remember that they had sort of banded together to form this loose association of different groups, but they still had distinctive ideas, even though they were trying to put those ideas to the side to accomplish this one initial goal. But there are some members of this movement that feel frustrated by Carrie Chapman Catt's conservative justification for suffrage. They feel like she's pandering. They feel like she's not representing what they're saying. So while I'm saying I really like her because I think that I know now she did it, like she got the amendment through, but their point would be at what cost? By coming out there and publicly saying, oh, women just still want to stay home, but we think that we can advocate for women's issues at the ballot box. You know, they felt that she was undermining what their cause ultimately was, which was a more equal view of women in the United States. So they said, you know, this isn't going to challenge traditional roles. They don't necessarily agree with support of temperance. These more liberal kind of women, right? And they also don't like Woodrow Wilson. And Woodrow Wilson is going to be the president whose ultimate change of heart about women's suffrage is going to be also what helps get this amendment across the finish line. And so they don't like that the women who are the leaders of this movement, a lot of them are pandering to Woodrow Wilson. And who are these women? There are women like Lucy Burns and Alice Paul. And what they will do is continue working with the National Women's Party to argue that the 19th Amendment alone is not sufficient enough to protect women's rights. So if you think about the 14th and 15th Amendment that guarantee the right to vote for African Americans, well, for former slaves, right? And then that guarantee equal protection under the law. That's what they want. They want another amendment. They want the 19th Amendment to go further and say that women have very clear legal protection for their rights, and that all discrimination based on the basis of sex would be prohibited. That never happens. That's going to be the Equal Rights Amendment that will be pushed for at various times throughout U.S. history. So the ERA, it will come back over and over and over again in U.S. history. We will talk about it. It always doesn't get a ton of support, and it's never been ratified, obviously. It wouldn't surprise me if it comes back up in the next 5-10 years, now, because it just always sort of continues to pop back up. They actually recently made a movie about the main about the fight for it in the 60s between Gloria Steinem and a woman named Phyllis Schlafly, who is the villain in this story, if we're being honest. But I don't know if any of you guys saw that movie. But anyway, the ERA. All right, so I'm going to stop here, and then we'll pick back up with a conversation about African Americans in the Progressive Era, and hopefully a lot of this conversation will be review, especially if you recognize those two names.